So how the actual hell have I been sitting here and talking to myself for 10 years? I'm not sure I know the answer. Where did the time go? How did this happen? This is always the way that it works, but it's been 10 years of the Crazy One podcast. 149 episodes. It's got to be over 100 hours of content from the beginning of July 2016 till today, just now. That's a long time. And I just wanted to take a minute, I guess, I'm not usually one that's big on looking back or doing that sort of thing, but I guess just sort of take a minute and recognize the milestone, to stop to think about, what have I learned? Hopefully, what have you learned? What were some of the biggest lessons we all learned along the way over the last 10 years? And to be able to sort of share that out. Because again, it's 150 episodes in 10 years. It feels like it's worth 30 minutes. So welcome to the 150th episode of the Crazy One podcast. As always, I'm your host, Stephen Gates. This is the show where we talk about creativity, leadership, design, and everything that matters to creative people. As always, just a little bit of quick housekeeping. Do me a favor, leave a review, hit the subscribe button. Any of those sort of things. I think, if you're looking for a good agency because you're tired of your old one, give me a call. Any of that sort of stuff. But it's been 10 years. And it's interesting because that's a real unit of time. I think it's worth stopping to look honestly instead of just like the highlight reel. What has been going on? And it's been interesting as we've sort of gone through this. So let's maybe go back to the very beginning. So 10 years ago, the first episode was called Light Bulbs Are Bullshit, which is born out of, which I think is still just as true today, if not more so, born out of my eternal war with the concept of creativity being a light bulb. I hate it then. I hate it even more now. Why? Because it makes what we do look easy, look dismissible, right? Like somehow we all just sit around waiting for lightning to strike and then it all figures itself out. And the argument then was that creativity is a blue-collar profession. It takes work and skill and talent and experience and a lot of those sort of things. And I think that's the interesting thing is that the industry conversation has changed completely in the last decade. That we've gone from doing things like portfolio tips into surviving an in-house culture, as that was all the rage, to now into AI and how to work with that and some of the existential dread that comes with that. But I think that, sort of episode after episode, I tried to keep the same deal that I felt like I made with you the whole time. That I'm always going to keep it honest. I'm going to share whatever it is I learn along the way to help you. But also, I think the deal I made with myself was the reason why I did that was it helped push me forward. I couldn't sit on past success. I need to keep thinking of new things and pushing myself and evolving. And that was sort of something I said all along the way was that for me, the show probably helped me maybe more than it helped you because it did some really rare things we'll talk about in a minute. But my deal also was, which is why there's been breaks in the show, I'm only going to put out content when it's worth sharing. I always rejected the idea of doing it on a schedule of doing it every week or every 2 weeks, because then I think you get into the trap of you're putting out content to appease a schedule, not because it's good, not because it's useful, not because your audience is going to like it, but because it's a schedule. And I think the last thing that I always did was the show has never had a sponsor. I've never sold ad space. Because candidly, I just wanted to be able to say whatever it was I wanted to say. I didn't have to worry about sponsors. And honestly, I never went into this, even today, with the thought of making money. And I know that that's a concept that probably sounds almost laughable now because I started the show, I think, honestly, before podcasts were really a big thing. Then they became a big thing. Then COVID hit and they weren't a big thing. Then coming out of COVID, it was all boot camps and, career coaches, and I felt like everybody had a seminar or a book or something they were trying to push, and that everybody had an agenda to get your money, like they were linked to advice. But this show was never about that, right? It was never about attracting sponsors. It was not one of those things. I think in the same way that like over the life of the show, I've never spent a penny to promote it. That it was always that, look, if the content was good enough, it will find its audience. And I think, if anything, the show and doing this thing has been a nice proof of concept for me that some things that I always thought or felt are true. And I don't know this. I think I talked about this maybe once in the life of the show. This goes back to why I actually started doing this. So I don't know what, 11 or 12 years ago, I had been actually writing blog posts because I felt like, that serious people are writers. The big flaw with that approach is that I am a designer by profession and a writer by necessity. Writing is not something that I love, but I did it because I felt like I should. And I went along and was sort of doing that, and then it started to turn into doing more speaking gigs because people liked some of the content. And I remember I was doing one speaking gig in particular. So there was one, I'd been invited to Graz, Austria. So it's a town that's about 2 hours south of Vienna. You fly into Vienna, you drive down through the Black Forest. Really cool town, like amazing food, didn't see it coming, had never heard of the festival. The town, I think the town's biggest claim to fame is like that's where Arnold Schwarzenegger was in Graz. And I remember I went to do the 15 Seconds Festival because it looked really big and really cool, and it was all those things, right? For whenever it existed, I continued to say it was like the best festival nobody ever heard of. But the first year was really impactful for me because it was the first time I was doing a lot of sort of canned talks, right? It was sort of the talk that I thought everybody wanted, of like a lot of easy advice and sort of very like fortune cookie things out. And it wasn't the content that I was passionate about. And I could tell it wasn't the sort of talk that I wanted to give anymore. And so I decided that like, look, this festival is big, but it's far enough away. I actually want to take a swing and do something different. So I went into that particular festival, and that talk really decided that I want to do something personal. I want to do something honest. I want to do something that sort of broke away from what I was seeing everybody else doing, that it was a risk, but I thought it was one that was worth taking and one I could land because it was just, the honesty was something I just felt drawn to. So I went and I did the talk. And the reason why I started the show is what happened after I did the talk. So there was a speaker's reception, sort of like attendee reception afterwards that was kind of like a low-grade rave at this big warehouse on the outskirts in Austria. And I'm standing there with a few other speakers that I'd met and people that I knew, and we're just all sort of chatting in this little circle, standing there in the middle of this basically warehouse. And my wife is with me. And for any of you that know my wife or have seen her, like my wife Whitney is absolutely my better half, love of my life, fierce and true. But she is equally just sort of very direct and honest and human in her approach. And what she was doing was something that I wasn't, was that she was actually watching what was going on in the outskirts of the circle that we were standing in. And she noticed there was a young man who was standing there who clearly wanted to come to talk to one of us, but sort of either didn't know how to break into the conversation, didn't sort of know how to, kind of come and start the conversation, right? It was very much like this kind of high school dance kind of dynamic. So very much in her way, she walked over and talked to him to a minute and then sort of put her arm around him and brought him over to the circle and brought him up to me and said, look, he really wants to talk to you, isn't sure how to do it, you two talk. So I said, okay. So I sort of stepped out of the circle and we're standing there. And I'm standing with this young man who's probably, I'm guessing, early 20s, mid-20s at his latest, maybe. And we're standing there. And he starts to cry. It's not the reaction you would sort of expect in a moment like that. It's not the reaction you would want, but he was clearly very, very emotional about something. And so he stood there for a few minutes and he kind of calmed down and he started to talk. And what he was telling me was that he really wanted to be creative. He really wanted to be a designer. And it's interesting in some of these countries where it culturally it's different. And I see it through India and Asia and through parts of Europe, where all of his family were accountants. And his father was not supportive in any way of him going out to become a designer or become a creative. It almost felt like in the conversation we had that he had come out to his father like he was gay, where his father had basically disowned him, said if that was a profession that he wanted to follow, that he was not going to support him, he didn't want to talk to him. It was clearly a very different dynamic than what I had really sort of seen or experienced before. And he was really, understandably, really emotional about this. And he went on to tell me that he had decided that he was going to basically sell most everything he owned to buy a ticket to this festival. And that the outcome of what he found there was really going to determine what he was going to do next. And that if he went there and he could find some people or some group or his tribe that he felt like really aligned with what he was saying, that then he was going to go against his family and just go make it work. But, and I think this was the part that set me down a totally different path that I didn't see coming. Because he'd said if he didn't, he was so distraught. He was so lost. He was so uncertain of what to do. He had decided that the other reason why he sold everything was that at the end of the festival, if he didn't find his people, if he didn't find somebody that he felt like gave him some hope, that he'd made plans to go to a bridge outside of town and he was going to kill himself. I was, I think, understandably speechless. I hadn't had a conversation like this before. I wasn't sure what the right reaction should have been. That I think obviously I've had a lot of experience with my father and things like that I'll talk about more in a minute. So I understand how difficult it can be, but I had never understood being creative in this sort of terms or this sort of stakes. And he went on to tell me that the talk I'd given, this first time I'd given something that was really personal and really honest, and I really shared what I had been going through, was the first time he felt like he heard somebody he could relate to. That all the rest of them were so polished and so overproduced that he felt like it was just an impossible standard that he couldn't attain. And I still talk to him today. And actually, I've ended up over the course of the show, there's probably about 5 or 6 people that I've had very similar conversations with. And I keep in touch with all of them for obvious reasons. But I remember flying back from that festival and sitting on the plane. And it rocked me to my core. Because I just sat there thinking that I have a message, I have a voice, I have something that can have an impact. And clearly sitting there trying to write about it or write blog articles or whatever it was, that wasn't going to be the way to get it done. And so I landed back home in New York, and it was the 3rd week in June. And I really just sort of said, because look, empirically, when I thought about it, the world didn't need another podcast. The world didn't need another white guy who thought he knew better than everybody else to share something. But I just couldn't get that kid out of my head. And I felt like the need for clarity, for honesty, for authenticity was so needed then that I had to do something differently. And so that's the real story of why the show started, was because in that moment, I felt like I have good material, I have these articles, and that's what the first couple episodes were, right? It was just sort of regurgitations of talks and articles before I found my footing and I found my voice. But I think that's the part for me where, as we start to look back, it really set the foundation for it. And I think doing the show has only validated for all of us that a few things are true, and they're still true today. I think one, more than anything, is that authenticity, humanity, realness cuts through. It cuts through the noise, and especially at a time now, right? I feel like there's more noise and bullshit on LinkedIn and everywhere else than there ever has been. There's more conjecture around what's going on than there's ever been. But if you show up, whether it's in a job search, whether it's in your job, whether it's in creating content, whatever it is you do, I've always felt that if you showed up as your authentic self and you really put out stuff that you really felt and really shared, that you'll find your audience. And I think I learned that, and that was sort of reinforced along the way, because I'm always big on going out and studying with other people who do what I do. And along the journey, one of the times I sat down with a comedian that's what he does for his profession. And I was always really interested around, how do you write jokes? What was your process? How do you know what works? And he told me something that very much aligned with that, where he said, Steve, the biggest laughs I get are always from the things that are the most honest, the most embarrassing, the most human. That always gets the biggest laugh because it's almost like a tension release. And I always thought that makes a lot of sense, because I think even in a lot of doing something like this, the best episodes have been the most human. There have been episodes that I've done around gender bias and like a lot of the Share the Mic shows after the murder of George Floyd, where I'm like, there's a decent chance I may end my career. But that's always the interesting thing is that, like I said, I think if you show up with authenticity, if you recognize that we all have a story to share, because I think that's the other part of this. And I think I've had to come to grips with this through doing the talks and doing the show, is that a lot of what I talk about, I'm not really sure why it needs to be a talk or it needs to be a podcast. Because a lot of the things to me feel very obvious. They feel like, oh, you look at that situation, you look at that problem, that feels like that should be the solution. But I think for all of us, not just me, it's a trick, right? That we think it is obvious, but whenever I stand on stage or I make a show and I say the thing, I see people write it down. They take photos of the slide, they share the show. So your story and your authenticity probably isn't as obvious as you think it is. That I think there's a lot of power and a lot of support and a lot of community in what that is. And that's always been my argument. Has been believing in yourself, standing up for yourself, understanding your brand, which is not a logo or a color or a website. Your brand, as in what do you stand for, is critically important. Because I think that's the other thing that I've realized over the past 10 years is while a lot does change, a lot still stays the same. That over 10 years, there's a lot of episodes that have remained the number one download because they're topics that still work. People still struggle with imposter syndrome and how to lead and how to do a lot of the things that I've talked about that I've struggled with over the course of the show. Now, I think there are parts of that are just, I've come to understand that they are evergreen. I'll be honest, there are other parts that are wildly frustrating. That there's a lot of talks that I have and episodes that I've done around corporate culture and creativity and things like that are just as popular today as they were 10 years ago. That is frustrating. The fact, I would hope that content would age really badly, that we would learn and move on and to do those sort of things. But I don't know. I think there's some things we learn and some things we don't. But I think in all of that, right, in thinking about authenticity and sharing your story, I think one of the best things that the show taught me, and I think one of the things that none of us do enough of, is the importance of finding time to focus and recognize that your creativity, your process, your approach, it's a tool, it's an instrument. And again, I think that's something to me that's been so valuable, is that the show forced me to create time to think about my process, to think about topics, to reflect on why I do things, to not just sort of hurtle headlong into the abyss, but that I think that every episode that I did where I tried to share some advice or some insight, what doubled for me as something that was sort of like a working session in real time too. That it gave me this structured time that was recurring, that was time to reflect. And again, I think that it's just, I think more and more people don't take that time to build it into their career. They just sort of jump from fire to fire. And I would be one of them. And I only got it because I forced myself to show up to a mic every week or so for 10 years until it became something that was more embedded in who I am. And again, I think it's just something to think about are you making time to do that? Do you understand, are you really showing up as your authentic self or not? Because if you're not, it is exhausting. And I think I only recognized that after I decided to step away and change some of my priorities around that. But I think that's the other thing that I've really learned, and I know I mentioned that a little bit before, is that I think one of the things to me that I hope the show has done is to get people to recognize that more people are having the problems that you're having than you realize. That, again, the number of episodes I've done on imposter syndrome, on like the value of design, on, right, like all of those sort of things are recurring, that I think they're all things that we struggle with, but we buy into this myth that there's a right way to do it, that there's a right way to go about this. And I joke with people all the time whenever I do mentoring that, look, nobody would tell you my career path was a good idea, because it's not. It wasn't. It only was after it happened, the same way that only after I opened my own studio, only after I launched the show, only after I've done it and it worked, then all of a sudden did everybody go, oh, no, we always knew it was going to be a success. Like, no, I remember the conversations. No, you didn't, right? But I think there's also that being the person that just speaks the thing, right? That says it out loud, that, whether that's for your team, for your company, for your community, like whatever that is, to be able to be the person that actually shows up and says the thing that gives other people permission to be that way. And I think whether that's from an emotional standpoint, whether it's from a creative standpoint, I still argue that everybody's creative. Most just everybody forgot. That I think that's the part of it is the journey. And I think that was probably the next thing that I really sort of thought about is, 10 years is a decent chunk of time. And if I think back to who I was, the sort of work that I was doing whenever I started this, I'm nowhere near the same person that I am today. And I think that for a lot of us, we really pressure ourselves sort of at every moment or every step in the journey to have everything figured out. And I think that's maybe one of the things with the show that I've really tried to lean into, sometimes in spectacular fashion, is a willingness to demonstrate, hopefully, that I don't have everything figured out, that I've been laid off 3 times, that I've shared that journey, that I tried looking for a job and hoping it was going to be this big success just to face plant and have it not work out and have to come out with a backup plan. But again, I think that it's just allowing yourself the grace that whatever your plan was doesn't need to be what your plan is. Because it's interesting that I think that's the thing I've realized in my career journey and the journey of making content and everything else. Nobody really remembers that plan but you. Nobody's disappointed by it but you. Nobody knows it went off track but you. That if you're doing it and you're happy, which often leads to then being successful, it's interesting how those things have changed. But also just the recognition that I think that it's just what's around you is going to change too. And I think that's a lot of what it is. When I think about sort of what's changed underneath me and around me, that, look, I went from the highs of being featured in 10 Apple keynotes and like doing incredibly cool work to the lows of being laid off 3 times, to the industry changing, to seeing us devalued, then in-house and wildly valued, and then that going away and the rise of AI. None of us could have predicted any of that. And I think that that's the thing is that, that's what led me to, I took 2 hiatuses from the show because I lost my voice. I lost my way in what that was. I felt like I wasn't sure I had anything to say anymore. I felt deeply broken and lost at more than one point over the last decade. And I think that that's where the show is maybe added some pressure or a different thing, because I think whenever you allegedly show up as somebody who can give other people advice and you don't know what to do with your own career, it's kind of like this atomic imposter syndrome that shows up. But I think we all go through that moment, right, where we're supposed to have it together, where we're supposed to do those sort of things. And I think a lot of it for me was I also have to acknowledge that probably what was the biggest discovery along this journey was the one that came from what was episode 108. I still remember it. And that was in 2020 when my father passed. And I think that the run up to whether he knew he was sick or not, but just we had conversations in 2019 and 2020 that he and I had never had before. That, 108 was an episode that I did to try to honor his life, to honor what he taught me, the career that, had been handed down. But it also was the recognition through those that I do think I have a bit of a different perspective, that I am somebody that has been able to see almost all of the arc of a creative career. Of somebody that, growing up with my dad who was, working, who owned an agency, who did a lot of those sort of things, who was very much in his prime, to then sort of struggling with relevancy, getting laid off, doing freelancing, sort of fading away, fighting, and then kind of accepting the lack of relevancy, I guess, in his work. And I think that it was something along the way when I started the show that I didn't see, and it hit me like a freight train along the way, was in 2019. I remember I was standing in the backyard of the house I grew up in, and we were standing out there with the grill cooking dinner, and all of a sudden he turned to me and he said, if I'd have known you whenever I was still working as a creative, I'd have had a completely different career. And it never occurred to me that the reason why I'm creating the show, why I'm trying to help all of you, was because in a lot of ways I was trying to save him. He was my first boss. He was my first creative director. He was my dad, right? And again, I think a lot of it was that I really have seen the very tangible damage that imposter syndrome does, that the fight for relevancy does, that what happens over the arc of your career as you start to come down the backside of what that looks like and, what do you want that to be? But I think that, for me, that was a lot of what I discovered along the way was actually starting to do this and create the content with one idea of why I was doing it, only to discover it was for a wildly different reason. And has sort of continued that because I know that the unspoken hypothesis he had was that he wasn't very talented, that, he had a lot of ideas that he didn't think anybody wanted. It was clear as day to me that after he passed and I cleaned out his studio, finding the postcards that were never sent, the promotional flyers for his work in addressed envelopes with stamps that were never sent, that where he'd let the imposter syndrome win. And I know that for me, it's why I get so incredibly fired up about this stuff, because I've seen the impact to one of the people I've loved the most in my life. And again, I can't imagine that on the scale of, I know, whatever it is, the 150 countries where people listen to the show, what that is like spread across an entire world. And it has been, right? And I think I've tried to share that journey. I think that a lot of what's been interesting to me has been also, I've long believed, right? And I think this goes back to the authenticity point, that how you show up matters. How you work matters. How you treat people matters. Now, I've certainly had more than a few moments where I have done things that I'm not proud of, treated people in ways that I regret, and other things along the way. But I've always felt like that was important. I think that maybe that's like the Pittsburgher in me, because Pittsburgh is very sort of blue collar. You do what you say, very, direct, hardworking. You show up, what you say means something. I think it's why I left New York to come back here, because it's just that's just sort of who I am. And it's been interesting because I think sort of in the episode 128 through 137, a lot of that was sort of talking about, leaving the system, of sort of leaving corporate culture, leaving agency life, trying to build my own thing with, crazy as my agency. But I think that a lot of it for me, that whenever I've talked about it, I haven't talked about it as a sales pitch, but I think that the show, even my agency, that there is something different. I don't know what. I don't know if it's normal or not. Again, this is the problem whenever I sit here and talk to myself, is that you can take this a lot of different ways. But I think a lot of this for me has been like sort of my thesis on that these things are important and that they do matter, having them play out. Because I think starting my own agency, you're talking about a lot of this stuff, it wasn't because it was a business story. It was because, to me, I wanted to prove that if you did things honestly and you made content for the right reason, you'd find an audience and people would care. That if you started a business and you treat people the right way and you really kind of concentrated on what went into doing good work, that it would matter. And I think, to me, it's an unintended consequence. One of the things I'm sort of proudest of is that the show found its following on zero spend and zero sponsors. That I'm 4.5 years into an agency, and 100% of our work, has come over 4.5 years, comes 100% on referral. And I think that I've argued it before, but I'm also very aware that sitting here is a very, at times, easy position. Because you can talk about things in theory. You can talk about things in a way where there isn't that sort of consequence necessarily. And I think that's often why I bristle at a lot of the other quote-unquote experts, because they want to offer you things because it's going to fund their way of doing things, right? Like you are almost their thesis. Your dollars are their thesis. And what they're trying to prove is that I can say something that will get people to give me their money. And whether I help them or not is almost kind of immaterial. But for me, doing the show for free and those sort of things was a thesis that, like, look, if you are authentic, if you do show up, if you say the hard thing, if you do that stuff, it has an impact. And it's been interesting because I think, if anything, that journey has made me more honest and more bold and more of a believer in that approach. And I think that was the thing, right? Because I think that's the honest, maybe harder truth in all this, was that I never set out to make, I don't know what you'd even call this, right? Like, this wasn't a self-help show for like myself with an audience that was watching. But I think that's almost closer to what it's been. I don't think that's a flaw in the show. I think it might be the reason that it's felt honest instead of just like making content. that sharing the things that have been the hardest, the layoffs, my father, the hiatus, right? Like those weren't things that were planned. And there were definitely moments where it would have been easier to not do the share the mic shows, to not get candidly the death threats and a lot of the stuff that came out of that. But I think that was the thing I just wanted to try to prove to myself time and time again, and maybe by extension help embolden some of you that those were the things that I just couldn't avoid. And that at some point, if you want to be the change, you have to stop criticizing the change, or stop criticizing the environment showing up as the change. And I think that was the thing for me that I always tried with varying success to do, was to be able to show up in that sort of way. And I think that, like I said, I think for me, whenever I reflect on it, that's what I've taken away from the last 10 years, is that we all have a story that's worth telling. That, the reason why you are different, the reason why that story is different, that is your superpower. That is the thing that makes you different, that makes you great, and you are going to have to fight through society and a corporation and a culture and a lot of things like that that are going to try to constantly tell you the opposite. That they value compliance and being like everybody else, but somehow expect results to the contrary. That, again, like what you think is your weakness is the thing that makes you the strongest, the worth listening to. The thing that scares you the most is the thing that, is the thing that's worth sharing. And that's the thing, is you don't need a podcast. You don't need to be loud. You don't need a place or a schedule where you sort of tell the truth. That, again, I think in 10 years, the thing I'm proudest of is that in doing it the way that I wanted to and talking about what actually mattered to me and staying honest, even when it was hard or scary or cost or whatever it was, it is worth it. It does have an impact. It does mean something that I think in a lot of ways I've proven to myself that I have value, that I have something to say, and I think ultimately that was why I started writing the articles way back in the day and started doing personal brand. Was I'd been laid off, and it just strips you of your value. It strips you of you thinking like I'm worth anything. And that's what is so incredibly dehumanizing about looking for a job or getting laid off or getting fired or any of those sort of things, is that you enter this phase of like, can somebody please tell me that I have value? And so I think that's what's been the most interesting, is that, still being human still matters. Sharing still matters. Doing these sort of things in an age where a lot of this, what quote unquote success looks like, may feel very different, still matters. And so this is the way I'm going to keep soldiering on and keep kind of going after this. I think hoping to help more of you be able to help with some of that. For those of you who don't know, I've left ADP list for various reasons that you can look up. I'm now on Hop, that was created by Design Buddies, where I'm doing free mentoring there. I'm doing group sessions. I'm doing things like that. So yeah, again, if you have those sort of things you want to talk about, that welcome to join me over there, and I'm happy to try to help out. But it is. And I think ultimately that's the thing, right? I always would, if you ever made it to the end of the show, I always wondered how many people did. To me, I guess that's the ultimate thing I wanted to say, was just thank you. Because in a lot of ways, all of you have helped me so much, right? Because there's a way whenever you do this where if it doesn't pan out, if you feel like you're talking to yourself, if you don't have any listeners, this doesn't last, right? But I think you've given me the opportunity to share this stuff, to be there, to listen, to react, to come up to me at events, at conferences, and airports, and everywhere else to stop and talk. And it means something, right? And I think that's why I always close the show to say, look, I know time is the only true luxury any of us have. I'm always incredibly humbled that you want to spend any of it listening to me. Because I think that's what I always tried to show up as, being somebody that was worth listening to in the ways that were easy and the ways that were hard. But again, I think I am a better person. I'm a better creative. I'm a better husband. I'm a better at all of those things because of all of you. I don't know a lot of you. I don't know your names. I don't know your faces, but thank you. If you've ever listened in that 10 years, have you ever done anything that, left a comment, left a review, it meant more than you know, and it kept me going through all of it. So a lot more planned, a lot more to talk about. Like I said, we're not stopping the content, but it felt like just because of the 150 and the 10 years, it was worth 35 minutes to just stop and share and reflect, to sort of reinforce the direction, to say thank you, and to keep going. So again, thank you for your time. Like I always say, I know time is truly the only real luxury any of us have. I'm always incredibly humbled you want to spend any of it listening to me. And as always, and for hopefully years still to come, stay crazy.